Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have on Rob Jackson. He's a chair of the Global Carbon Project, a senior fellow at Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment and Precourt Institute for Energy, and a professor of earth science at Stanford University. Through global scientific leadership and groundbreaking research, communications, and policy activities, Rob's work has reduced millions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions and improved human health, safety, and air and water quality. One of the top 5 most cited climate and environmental scientists in the world, he has authored more than 400 peer-reviewed publications, and his writings have appeared in many outlets, including the New York Times, Scientific American, and the Washington Post. And his newest book, available now, is called Into the Clear Blue Sky: The Path to Restoring Our Atmosphere. Rob, it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, guys. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. And so as we were telling Rob before, like it's such an honor to have him on.
Mhm.
So I mean, the fact that to be a top 5 leading most cited scientist in the world is a pretty amazing accomplishment. And so before I get into the passages, I just wanted to say, because we don't normally cover these kind of topics, climate change is an incredibly important topic. I know we haven't really gotten into it. We are certainly not experts in it by any means, but we are really excited to learn about it. So from the book, Rob wrote, from quote unquote code red reports highlighting climate calamities to gleaning white wind turbines to hydrogen and greener blue hues, a rainbow of climate consequences and technologies unfurls before us. Before exploring new technologies and climate solutions, however, we must grapple with issues of fairness and equity, consumption and demand, ethics and justice. New technologies will help us restore the atmosphere to pre-industrial health, but we can't simply build our way out of climate change, no matter how green new technologies may be. We live in a time when the top 1% of the world's population contributes more fossil carbon emissions than half the people on Earth. In class, I call our time, somewhat facetiously, the Miocene, the era in which the top tenth of humanity emits half or more of global carbon pollution. What do global hyper-consumers in the United States and elsewhere gain by consuming so much? Not much, my research suggests. I led a recent analysis of health, well-being, and energy use across 140 countries. Energy use was linked positively to every aspect of well-being we examined, including infant mortality, life expectancy, air quality, food supply, happiness, and prosperity, but only to a point. People's lives improved substantially with access to more energy, but the benefits plateaued as energy uses well below the global average. People in energy-rich countries fared no better than people in countries who used many times less energy per person. Some of us could apparently use far less energy without compromising our health, happiness, or prosperity, and possibly improving our mental and physical health by reducing stress and decluttering our lives. Everybody needs access to a minimum threshold of energy for a decent quality of life, but using 4 times the global average nets to US residents nothing, at least for the metrics of well-being we examined. So this is really amazing. And the first question, just to get into some of the basics here. So my question is going to be just in terms of energy consumption. So first of all, I know simple question, but what is methane emission? Where does it come from? And how do we contribute to it?
Well, for methane in particular, of course, methane's other name is natural gas.
Yep.
Methane makes up 95% of the gas that comes into our homes, that goes to power plants. 2/3 of it nowadays comes from things that we do. The energy sector, everything from drilling oil and gas wells to pipeline leaks, like my team's mapped, leaks inside our homes. And also agriculture provides more methane than the energy sector. Cows are the world's largest source. Methane is formed naturally in wet, warm, waterlogged environments that are low in oxygen. So a wetland and a rice paddy are not that different from the stomach of a cow. They're sort of warm, low oxygen, sloshing environments. So cow burps emit as much methane as the oil and gas industry.
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Landfills are another big source. Landfills and waste in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then so when we're thinking about sort of again energy consumption, so I want to get into some of the politics of this. So what is it that you think is going on when we have these debates about whether climate change is real, how much we're actually contributing to it, and where does the sort of financial factor play a role here?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It goes back decades. It actually goes back hundreds of years. Scientists were quite clear in the 1800s of how greenhouse gases warmed the Earth, and the fact that if we continue to burn coal and fossil fuels, the Earth would warm substantially. This goes back to the 1890s and earlier. Even companies like Exxon in the 1960s determined from their own research that continued fossil fuel burning sort of, at a continued business as usual pace could be catastrophic for the Earth's climate. They determined this 50, 60, 70 years ago, but chose not to act on it. And so we've known how greenhouse gases affect the Earth and warm the climate for decades to centuries. And the biggest surprise, honestly, has been how fast and how sensitive the Earth has been. The Earth has warmed faster than scientists predicted, and, including myself. So we're seeing the effects today of climate change. I thought I'd be talking about my grandkids' lives, but we're talking about our lives right now.
Yeah, so sometimes people criticize the data and they would say something like, "Oh, well, it's impossible to predict." But you're ultimately saying that rather than thinking, I guess, rather than being, let's say, catastrophizing about it, rather than sort of being alarmist about it, you're actually saying that if anything, you guys underestimated the speed of which.
We are, exactly. We underestimated the rate of climate change. We all know that the weather's gone weird. The NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, tracks billion-dollar disasters. They've been tracking them for 40 or 50 years. Last year, 2023, shattered the record for the number of most disasters all time. We saw Lahaina burn, we saw flooding in New York, California, Florida. And we're already paying for these disasters. We're paying 50 to $100 billion a year for them, and they happen twice
Wow.
as often today as they did just a few decades ago. So we can't predict when a disaster happens, but we can analyze statistically, are there more disasters today? And there most certainly are, even after you adjust for the effects of inflation.
Yeah. So
Wow. So one thing I want to bring up, so in the book you describe methane as like public enemy number two, essentially, right?
Mhm.
What sort of innovative technologies or methods are being researched to sort of draw down methane in order to combat that issue?
Yeah, carbon dioxide is the most important greenhouse gas. There are a trillion tons of legacy carbon pollution floating around in the atmosphere. Most of that trillion tons will still be in our air in 1,000 years. But methane's really different in a couple of respects. It's 90 times stronger than carbon dioxide at warming the Earth after only a couple of decades in the air. And it goes away much more quickly. It lasts only about a decade, which means if we could reduce emissions today, we could see concentrations in the atmosphere drop within 10 or 20 years before 2050 and in the lifetime of listeners of this show. That's the only greenhouse gas for which that's true.
wow.
And what's, for example, one particular method? Like I remember reading in the book, and forgive me for not um, remembering this well, but there's some sort of compound or something that could be fed to cows that kind of breaks down how the methane is produced or reduce how much they produce.
That's right. I mentioned that cows and their ruminant cousins are the largest source from human activities. You can do two things to reduce emissions from cows. You can reduce the number of cows on Earth from 1.5 billion to a smaller number by eating a more plant-based diet. And whatever cows are left, we need some way to cut the methane burps from those cows. And yeah, researchers are looking at feed additives. There are species of algae
Mm.
that contain bromine. There are chemicals. There are feed additives now that are being sold in the United States and in other countries to cut methane emissions. And they cost a little bit more, but in some cases, they actually help the cow grow a bit faster or produce a bit more beef and dairy, so that there are some additional benefits to using them.
Mm.
Yeah. And so
Fascinating.
in terms of actually people understanding the science, right? So because I think this is where most of us struggle. So as just I don't know, everyday thinkers, we're pretty what's the word? So we're pretty kind of keen on cause and effect, where we want to see, what affects what, right? Essentially. So I think that when it comes to a lot of the data, it's for a lot of people, it's hard to understand long-term effects. Like big tobacco is kind of an example of this. So we had what are called, or what were called, the merchants of doubt, where the understanding was, well, the science isn't clear. There's still a debate about it, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we can't really prove that cigarettes cause cancer. And I think for the most part, at the time, at least, when, this sort of started, the public was kind of like, yeah, how do you know that it's cigarettes? How do we know that it isn't other things in the environment? How do we know that it's not random, et cetera? So can you actually get into some of the science and helping us understand, again, how these causal relationships happen, especially in the world where we can't necessarily see them?
Sure. Well, we use different tools and take different measurements to understand the Earth's climate. We look back in time over the scales of millions of years and look at what temperatures were in the past, what the concentrations of different greenhouse gases were in the air. And you can do that literally for 1 million or 2 million years using ice cores and the ice core record that comes from Antarctica and Greenland that
Mhm.
preserve little bubbles of the atmosphere in in layers each year that are laid down in snow and ice. So we have a direct record of what the atmosphere has been like for 1 million or 2 million years. We know that greenhouse gases over that period have never been as high as they are now because of human activities.
Mhm.
But then we also, there are models, there are experiments to assess what greenhouse gases do. There's a lot of misinformation. Like I cannot tell you the millions of times in my career I've heard people say, well, trace gases like carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide, they're only present in the atmosphere at, parts per million, tiny concentrations. They can't possibly influence the Earth's temperature, but they do because they absorb in particular wavelengths that otherwise uh, you know, uh, would cool the Earth. The heat and energy would go radiated back into space if they weren't there. So it isn't. They don't. Sorry, I'm. Uh,
It's
the
okay.
dominant gases in the atmosphere, nitrogen and oxygen, are not greenhouse gases. So the gases that absorb re-radiated energy are relatively low concentration and quite powerful. So we understand how the Earth works, and the idea that there's any controversy about whether climate change is happening or whether it's caused by our greenhouse gas emissions and other activities is simply, a century or two out of date.
Wow.
Mm.
So why do you think it still does feel like, I mean, and I understand this is more of a psychological question and a little bit more of a, I guess what's the word? A little bit more conjecture here, but I guess I wonder, why do you think, especially based on the fact that you do this for a living, and I mean, you and your colleagues have known this for decades, why do you think, at least in some parts of the media, it still feels like this is such a controversial topic?
I think there are powerful industries and trade associations that don't want this message to be out there. They don't want to have to change. And the I mentioned that ExxonMobil in its own internal communications clearly outlined the causes of climate change and global warming linked to greenhouse gas emissions from burning gas and oil and coal that they produce. So companies have known that, but trade associations in the industry don't want people to say, all right, the logical outcome of that is that at some point we must stop burning fossil fuels or at least capture the pollution from them and do something with it, like trying to pump it underground.
Mm.
But it's getting to a particular point where we say not just greenhouse gases are warming the earth, but by this date we need a plan to end fossil fuel use and go to cleaner, healthier green energy. And so I think it's the end point that's hard for people to deal with. So our plants are old, our industries are old, even the appliances in our house last for decades. So we don't like to change things that cost a lot of money. And frankly, there are powerful interests in seeing us continue to burn, extract fossil fuels.
Mm. With the advent of EV, like electric vehicle use, solar power, that becoming more sort of mainstream over the years, are you sort of optimistic about our future?
I am optimistic about our future.
Yeah.
Part of the process of writing this book for me was to go find inspiration to meet people who are changing the world around them, whether that world be their neighborhood, their city, their company, or
Mhm.
a global industry, CEOs transforming the steel industry. The two biggest sources of pollution, greenhouse gas emissions in lives of people here in the U.S. are cars and transportation as one, and our
Mm.
homes and buildings as the other. I think EVs are winning market share, not just because they're better for the environment, but they're simply better products. They're faster, um, and just more fun to drive. I test drove an electric motorcycle
Huh,
in one of the
wow.
chapters in my book, which was the most amazing thing to ride that I had ever ridden. The fact that it also happened to be better for climate is fantastic. And for our homes and buildings, the number one thing we can do is to transfer off gas and go to cleaner electricity. And the reason for doing that isn't just climate. As I document in another chapter, we are releasing NOx gases, benzene pollution directly into our homes every time you flip a knob and turn a burner
Yeah.
on or turn the oven on. And we measure those pollutants and know that they harm people, trigger asthma and other things. So climate
Wow.
solutions are also solutions that make us healthier and save lives.
Right, right. Can we actually get into that a little bit? Because I think when the average person, I mean, honestly, myself included, to be fair. So I think with the average person, when we think of turning a knob, we think, okay, so the gas is in the air for what, about maybe like 5 seconds. You make your tea, you cook your meal, whatever it is. Well, the meal is going to be obviously much longer, but for as long as the knob is sort of turned, right, that's as long as the gas kind of permeates the air, and then once it's gone, you stop smelling it. That's it. You're done. And you kind of go back to normal. But that's actually a myth.
It is a myth, and
Yeah.
the certain pollutants are formed only when the flame is on. And NOx gases are a good example. I've mentioned them a couple of times. They trigger asthma. They're harmful for our lungs and hearts. We have catalytic converters on our cars specifically to destroy gases like NOx because we don't want them in the air of our cities. So if we don't
Mm.
want them in the air outside, and we've done a lot to clean up our air outside, why wouldn't we want to improve our air indoors where people spend 80, 90% of their time these days? So NOx is formed at very high temperatures, thousands of degrees, when you heat air and mix the nitrogen and oxygen that's found in air, and it forms when the gas is burning, and it doesn't form with electric induction or other electric stoves because those stoves don't heat the air to thousands of degrees. So
Wow.
we've shown those gases, and benzene is another one, a carcinogen. They form as soon as the flame is on, and when you turn the flame off, it takes hours for the pollution to leave your home. And it can be in the kitchen. We've shown that it migrates to bedrooms within half an hour, say, and can stay above safe thresholds for many hours every time you cook, which might be 2 or 3 times a day.
Wow. So, and what makes this so frustrating, I don't know if you remember last year, I think it was, oh my God, it was a Republican talking point about the stoves. Remember that they were like, oh, the liberals want to take all our stoves away.
Oh yeah, something about not using electric stoves,
Yeah, yeah,
something
yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, Rob, so what are your thoughts on that? So, why would you? Why, oh, again, these are we're talking suppositional territory here. But what do you think is going on with again your average voter is saying, yeah, the government is trying to take away our stoves, and we don't want that to happen.
Well, I know a lot about this because it was our work that prompted some of the
Mm.
discussions, measuring, documenting benzene and NOx emissions. People are attracted. They like cooking with gas. They're used to it. I think all of us have had an experience in our life where you went to a camp and cooked over a lousy electric stove. It didn't work very well. The new
Hmm.
induction ones are brilliant, faster and better. But no one likes to be told what to do. I mean, let's be honest, right? If you have something and it's not at the end of its life, why should you want to replace a gas stove that doesn't need replacing necessarily? That's why I support an orderly transition. So setting dates in the future where new construction should be cleaner for the environment and healthier for us indoors. That's what the state of New York has done. They have a law that requires new construction after 2026 or 2027. You may know all about this.
Hmm.
Um, that requires new homes and buildings to have electric instead of gas hookups for cooking and other appliances. I believe that's the law.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And one thing I found very fascinating in the book too is that you draw a parallel between restoring the atmosphere and preserving artworks, like those in the Sistine Chapel. Can you expand on what cathedral thinking means to you in the context of climate science.
Cathedral thinking is the idea that people, for some things, have to think more than one generation into the future to be able to realize their objectives. And cathedral thinking really means that it takes 100 years or more to build a cathedral. So you have to plan for people finishing the cathedral who weren't there when that project was started and put things into motion to assure that the project comes to fruition. So cathedral thinking is long-term thinking about how we shepherd objects. I went to the Vatican because they take care of, hundreds of thousands of ancient relics and paintings and art. I went to the Sistine Chapel because they had just completed a beautiful restoration of the frescoes there that Michelangelo painted, including the beautiful skies that they sort of peeled the grime off and restored this amazing lapis lazuli blue sky that was, just remarkable to see. And for me, it's a metaphor about our own atmosphere that we need to do the same. Our goal should be not to stabilize the Earth at some temperature, but to put the atmosphere and the Earth back closer to how it was before the Industrial Revolution. That's my dream as a climate scientist.
Wow. And okay, I'm going to ask you somewhat of a silly question, but I do think the answer is really worth hearing. How did you choose, or obviously you and your colleagues, how did you all of you choose the point of the Industrial Revolution as I guess a turning point for humanity?
Well, mostly it's because, once again, if you look at the ice core record and the paleo record, people have been altering the Earth for 10,000s of years. We've been burning land, clearing land for crops. But it's only in the last couple hundred years that we've really transformed the atmosphere and our waters in a global way. And so, if you can go back 100, 200 years, there's really no single date, but go back in time before we started burning billions and billions of tons of coal and oil and natural gas. That pollution is all over the Earth. It isn't just greenhouse gases in the air. It's the mercury that permeates sediments even in the Arctic and the North Pole, the methyl mercury that causes problems for people because of coal burning and essentially nothing else. So it's trying to remove or kind of repeal the legacy of greenhouse gas and industrial pollution is how I would answer.
Gotcha. Yeah, because did you want to say something? Yeah, because I think because when some people think about that, they would, I think, let's maybe sort of, what's the term here? They would sort of not map, but they would, I think, kind of fix civilization onto the Industrial Revolution. I'm sure you've heard this argument before, where the thinking is, well, like Rob, what would you rather have us do? Do you want us to go back to the Stone Age? What would you say?
No, I think that's right. I mean, energy, fossil fuels have saved lives by providing people with reliable energy. There are still hundreds of millions of people on Earth who don't have access to reliable electricity. And I think for those people in India and countries in Asia and Africa in particular, they may need to continue burning fossil fuels, but we don't need that in Europe and here in the United States. We have cleaner renewables, cleaner options for our homes, and we don't need to do that. And we don't need to surround ourselves with the pollution from burning fossil fuels that we continue to do. So I get energy has been good for us. Fossil fuel use has saved lives in many cases by bringing people out of poverty. Energy access has saved lives by bringing people out of poverty. And if you're one of the billion people still cooking over wood or dung in your home, then natural gas is cleaner than whatever you were cooking on. But for all the rest of us, gas is dirtier and electricity is cleaner. So there are people in the world who still need more energy, but that's not true for almost anyone listening to this program.
Oh wow! So okay, so when we're now thinking about electrical energy, right? So the arguments against it would essentially be financial. So people would say something like, "Listen, how many people are going to be able to afford a Tesla, and even electric stoves?" I mean, the understanding is, especially for landlords, why they don't want to put them in is fundamentally because they're more expensive, right? So how do we sort of now not? I mean, how do we make sense of it? Number one, but then how do we? I guess how do we make it so that there are sort of policies in place? There may be tax credits of some sorts. How do we make it so that a lot of this technology is easier to access for everyday people?
Yeah, and I think the everyday people is a key part. I work with lower income communities in the Central Valley of California. And people in cities like Bakersfield have the dirtiest air outdoors in the country. and they have dirtier air indoors too. They're in poor communities, their appliances are older. They can't open a window in summer. It's 115 degrees out and the air is dirty from oil and agricultural activity. So
Wow.
those folks need the most help to make a transition. But there are a couple of different ways you can go, right? You can try and incentivize with carrots, or you can try and use sticks. We like carrots in the U.S. We incentivize, solar and batteries, the way the Inflation Reduction Act has.
Hmm.
We incentivize cleaner power, which is good. But the more effective way to change the world is to price pollution. There was a recent study out of Europe that looked at 50 years of policies around the world in dozens of countries. And the only things that worked consistently were to levy a price on pollution for the things that we wanted to emit less of. And we aren't willing yet in the United States to do that, to really say the polluter should pay. And if the polluter paid, we would pay more for the products because we ultimately would be paying for that pollution. And I think that's the best solution, the most effective solution, but it's not a likely solution in the US right now.
Mm. Right, because the thinking there would essentially be, I'm kind of sort of trying to play a little bit of contrarian here because I want to, because I'm sure you have really great answers here, and I'm sure our audience at least will have some of these questions. So, what would happen if the other person said, "Yeah, but Rob, but what happens to the jobs then?" Right? So, our employer has to pay an extra tax, whatever it is. Then they're going to say, "Well, we can't afford as many employees, or we have to cut the cost there." So, how will we kind of navigate that, especially around this particular argument?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I would point to a couple of kinds of examples. You look back at things like the Clean Air Act, which was bipartisan, has been improved several times. The Clean Air Act saves hundreds of thousands of lives a year in the United States at a 30-fold return on investment. So because
Wow.
of the improvements in health and other things, we're saving money by releasing or reducing air pollution. So it's not a zero-sum game in terms of what we spend. Sometimes we spend money, make ourselves healthier, and actually spend and save money at the end result. But it isn't easy though. Take gasoline. If there was a gasoline tax, the poor people would suffer the most. I could probably pay. I don't drive a gasoline powered car anymore, but relatively wealthy people could probably afford that, but poor people can't. And you
Mm.
have to acknowledge that. So those folks either need to get the money back, through a rebate program, or they need other other help to offset the additional cost of the prices on dirty energy that we would pay. And I think ultimately that's more likely where if we price pollution, we would all be healthier, especially poorer people. And if we paid a little bit more for our energy, we'd have to find a way to make that revenue neutral. I don't like the government having extra money to spend any more than the next person does. So if we took in extra money from a carbon price, we ought to find a way to give that money back to people who need it the most.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think with major industry, I mean, for a lot of these people, fundamentally, I mean, there's always going to be some excuse to cut costs. So it's kind of like, I mean, again, like I said before, with cause and effect, it's easy to say, well, the causal relationship seems to be, higher tax for these companies, and maybe even lack of subsidies, whatever, the sanction may be. And then fundamentally, we decided to cut costs in such and such way. But I think as a country, we really find it hard to accept that a lot of these companies, they cut costs anyway. It doesn't matter if you can point to this cause, which is fine. You can say, okay, this is the reason why I did that, or they did that. But fundamentally, I mean, they would have found ways to cut costs anyway. And I think for a lot of people, because I mean, obviously, we all rely on employers, and I think for a lot of people, it's really hard to admit this just happens to be one particular reason. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the only one, or that they wouldn't have found others.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's the insurance industry is telling us that the cost to address climate change is far less than the cost of not addressing climate change. Companies like Swiss Re just came out with a report last year that documented this. They concluded that the cost of climate inaction far outweighed and dwarfed the cost of climate action. So we're not really very good about assembling costs, even in the scientific community, right? And I mentioned air pollution a couple of times. I mean, the air is better than it was when I was a kid. It's cleaner. Our water's cleaner in the U.S. But pollution from coal and cars still kills 100,000 Americans a year. And 1 in 5 deaths worldwide, 10 million senseless deaths a year, comes from the burning of fossil fuels. We don't need that anymore. So what's the cost of that? I mean, you can make a cost based on the value of a life, but it's it's an abstract idea. We're killing ourselves with fossil fuel pollution. We don't need to be.
Yeah.
And in the book, you describe something called climate colonialism and the concept of sacrifice zones. Could you explain these terms and discuss their relevance to climate policy and global responsibility?
Yeah, I don't use a term like climate colonialism lightly, but I think it's appropriate for climate change. And the example that I used in the book was the case of Pakistan, where a year or two ago they had record flooding. A third of Pakistan was submerged by a monsoon turbocharged by um, warmer water temperatures, ocean temperatures, and climate change. And Pakistan emits almost no greenhouse gas emissions per person compared to a country like the US. So
Hmm.
they and other poor nations are paying the price for our pollution. And I think colonialism, where you thrust sort of the expenses, or you gain at the expense of other people in other countries around the world, is what's happening with climate change. Poor people in the US and poor countries around the world are the least able to pay the cost and the price of dealing with climate change, and yet they have to. Island nations in the Pacific, their countries are disappearing, and they didn't cause that problem. They just have to deal with it because they don't have any choice.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that's what we do here. I mean, it's easier for us because for the most part, even though there are increased hurricanes, etc., I mean, the understanding is maybe not the understanding, but I think the experience rather is that it's nowhere near as severe as it is for the poor countries. So for them, they're the ones who would really like deeply experience it. And for the rest of us, it's kind of easy for just for us to stick our head in the sands and think like it'll just go away.
Yeah, plus I guess
I mean,
my oh yeah,
go
sorry, go
ahead.
ahead. Oh,
No,
sorry,
please.
yeah. Yeah, I just guess my thought is just how can we sort of take on a fair share of the burden? I mean, because if you are going to be impacting countries like Pakistan in that way, I mean, you can't just let it go. I mean, you do have to do something about it. And I'm just wondering, what is it that I suppose we can? I mean, I understand, of course, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, fossil fuel emissions, and methane gas emissions for sure. But I was just wondering, is action really being sort of taken on that, to reduce the burden for countries
Right.
like that?
And can I just add on really quickly?
Please.
So, and just to add on to that too, I would ask, is it also the case that at least for the most part, the kind of well-off countries or whatever, if you want to still call them first world countries, but like the more well-off countries are saying that's their problem, not ours.
I would say it's somewhere in between. It's not the case in Europe. I think Europe has reduced their emissions far more than we have in the
Hmm.
United States. Um, and they've been better about sort of uh, climate finance, so trying to help poor countries adapt to climate change, or adopt the clean energy transition faster. India's a great example, right? India's per capita emissions are 1/8 or 1/10
Mm,
ours in the US. I've already mentioned they have hundreds of millions of people who lack reliable electricity and clean water and things. Their only fossil fuel is coal. They're building coal plants, um, and they're also building solar facilities like crazy.
mm,
And so if we, it's not really fair to tell India you can't burn your coal because we burned our coal. I would argue as a climate scientist, and when we think about ethics, but it's also complicated to think about what are we willing to give them so that they don't burn their coal and they go right to a cleaner transition for the benefit of the earth. What are we willing to give countries like Brazil so that they don't cut their rainforest the way we cut our forests 150 years ago?
Mm.
So
mm,
the whole world of climate finance is complicated. We are sending some money to countries like India to help them move to clean energy quicker, but not nearly the amount that they need. And it's a tough sell in Congress. You imagine in Congress trying to tell a bipartisan group, well, what we really need to do to help the climate solution is send India a bunch of money so they can buy solar panels instead of build coal plants. That's a
Yeah.
tough sell
mm.
on many fronts.
Yeah, so then I am curious, what was your thought about when AOC a few years ago, when she was just elected? What was your thought when she had a protest in Nancy Pelosi's office about the Green New Deal? You remember that?
Yeah, look, yeah, of course I do. I'm a little well, I'm old, but I'm a little old school
Hmm.
in the sense that I don't really identify with any political party these days. I'm
Hmm.
fiscally conservative and socially liberal.
Hmm.
Mhm.
So I regret the fact that students in my classes don't know that most of the major pieces of environmental legislation in the US were signed by Republican presidents, and that things are not always the way they are now, have not always been the way they are.
Hmm.
So, I feel like AOC felt like she was doing the right thing. It feels a little bit like a stunt in some ways, but I don't really want to rehash that. The Inflation Reduction Act, which isn't the same as the Green New Deal, but arose or grew out of some of the ideas, has been amazingly helpful for jobs in the economy and for incentivizing clean energy. So it's been a good thing for the country.
Can you tell us a little bit about what it entails?
Yeah, it incentivizes things like solar panels and batteries for homes. It has money for especially people in lower income brackets to get rebates and incentives for replacing their gas appliances with electric.
Hmm.
It tries to tackle methane in other ways, other industries, everything from aviation, energy efficiency is a big part of it. So it's incentivizing energy efficiency and clean energy to a large degree.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's really wonderful. And then, so I guess, what were your thoughts? Because I don't want, so we don't have to talk about it if you feel uncomfortable, but I am super curious. So, what were your thoughts when Trump pulled out of the Paris Accord? And did you feel any hope after that?
Well, I think as a climate scientist, it's a disaster. As an American, it's a bad look. I mean,
Mm.
I think there will come a time where if we keep thumbing our nose at the world, we're responsible for more legacy greenhouse gas pollution in the air than any country on Earth. If we keep thumbing our nose at the rest of the world, eventually people are going to stop buying American products, not because they're a different price, but simply because they're American. They won't, they'll get sick and tired of us not doing anything. So I'm worried about our nation's standing in the world if we just choose not to act on climate. So I hope we stick with the Paris Accord and future agreements to send the world a message that we care about them, we acknowledge some responsibility, and let them know that we care and want to make the world better. It doesn't matter whether someone's a Democrat or a Republican. We all want a better world for our kids, cleaner air, cleaner water. We want our kids to have a better life than we had, and I think that should extend beyond the United States to people in other countries too. That
Yeah.
feeling of growth for the next generation.
Yeah, but I think the difficulty is we have a party that really believes it's a hoax. So I guess, would you feel hopeful hypothetically if, let's say, if Trump were again in office, and then, I mean, you know what his views are on climate change. What would your perspective be? Just generally, I'm not saying like
Yeah,
what do you think about Trump, anything like that, but what do you think about it in the context of climate change?
based on his first term pulling out of the Paris Accord, as hard as he was on federal agencies that deal with climate change, I'm extremely concerned about um, not just not just what Trump will do, but perhaps a Congress too. 10 years ago there were many Republicans, particularly in Florida, caucusing around climate change. They understand the costs of sea level rise in a state like Florida, but somehow it's no longer acceptable to even talk about it. People can't get out of their primary system, which is a whole nother subject. So it isn't just Trump, it's a whole party that seems to want to ignore the reality around us and the benefits of transforming to clean energy for everyone and especially the poor
Right.
Mm.
I
and the
mean,
working, not just the poor, the working families, normal families in the US.
right. Have some, just curious in terms of going back again to politics. So have some of your arguments been helpful in terms of referencing Richard Nixon, how the Environmental Protection Agency started, et cetera? I mean, has it fallen on deaf ears, or are some Republicans, or have they been receptive to it?
Sometimes people are receptive to it too. The history is long. Nixon formed the EPA, the Clean Water Act
Mhm.
um, came around 1970. Clean Water and Clean Air Acts through the 1990s. Reagan signed the Montreal Protocol, the greatest environmental agreement ever signed worldwide, saved millions of lives, and and millions of skin cancers. Um, Even George Bush signed the Framework Convention on Climate Change with the United Nations. So I interviewed George Shultz in my book, former Secretary of State for President Bush, precisely to show that there are Republicans who believe climate change is real and that the precautionary principle should be applied to climate change the same way it's applied to nuclear war and the ozone shield.
Wow. And can you get into that a little bit about the specifics of your interview with him?
Yeah, I can. He's no longer with us, but yeah, I went to see him. The first impression when I went to see him is how impeccably dressed he was, like perfect. You know, he had the suit, he had the little, the pocket handkerchief that matched his tie perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
He was just, he was 100, and he was completely pulled together. I was so impressed. He had all these awards on the wall behind him. I felt like he could have changed them every day and taken one picture off, set it in a drawer, and put another one up. Some other some other thing he's won. But we talked about the legacy of the Montreal Protocol, the discovery of the ozone hole, how much resistance there was initially to acting on the ozone hole. But he talked about the pulling together the scientific information, going to President Reagan, him and some other people, and just saying, look, here's what we think we know about it. We think this is really serious. If it's correct, if the scientists are correct, this is catastrophic for humanity, and it would have been catastrophic for humanity and other species if we had not acted. And Reagan was able to see that action was both warranted and safer than inaction. And so he signed that protocol, and we've been watching the atmosphere get better ever since. The ozone hole is still here in the Arctic fall and winter, but things are improving.
Wow. When do you remember the shift happening in the party?
Um, yeah, somewhere I would say Reagan did a lot of good things. He dealt with the Soviet Union well. He was fiscally conservative. He did not, in my opinion, value the environment sufficiently, or was not willing to spend money on environmental issues. And then I would say maybe starting with Reagan and then going into the Bush administrations, George H.W. Bush was probably more interested in the environment, and George W. Bush maybe less so, but by today's standards, both Bushes are almost Democrats, so it's hard to know hard to know where we stand. Even take somebody like Maggie Thatcher, the super conservative prime minister of the UK.
Mm-hmm.
She got up in front of I think it was the United Nations, and said, we have treated the atmosphere like a dustbin, talking about pollution. And then 10 years later was sort of dismissing climate change. So I don't know exactly how that transition happens, or why it happens. I'm sorry that it happens.
Yeah. Yeah, because with Gen Z, I mean, it's getting much better, as you know, obviously with Greta Thunberg, who's been, I guess she's pretty prominent in the media. I guess, and what are your thoughts just in terms of the younger generation, how they're viewing it, and even her just specifically? I mean, I don't want to say that she's sort of the forerunner of it, not necessarily true, but she's certainly a pivotal person, I guess, in the movement.
I mean, a lot of people don't like her. I think she's amazing, frankly. I mean, you take a young woman, she has changed the world out of personal vision and will, and you have to credit her for that, whether you agree with her or not. And I do happen to agree with her. I may not agree with everything she does. I don't think young people should be throwing paint on artworks in museums, but that's not what Greta suggests. But I think you have to hand it to her and to other youth movements. They are and have changed the world, and I think they get it in ways that that older people don't. I interview a young person, Grace Gibson Snyder, in the book. She was one of the plaintiffs in the Montana climate lawsuit. And she said something like, I don't have a choice about whether I deal with this. I have to deal with this for my entire life. So I want action.
Yeah.
And so young people get it. And I think Greta deserves a huge amount of credit, whether you like every specific thing she does or not.
Yeah. Are you finding that for the most part, it's actually younger people who care about it more, whereas opposed to some of the older generations, it's kind of hard to convince them?
On average, yes, I think young people are energized, galvanized about climate change. They deal with grief in ways that I think older generations don't. So psychologically, like the kinds of people you talk with on the show regularly, I think psychologically it's a heavy burden that the young people bear.
Mm.
And it's, you get lots of questions like, should I have kids and
Mhm.
things like that. I mean, those are heavy questions for young people to have to deal with.
Right, right. Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of people are really, or if they feel really guilty about having kids. I'm curious, Alan, what do you think about that, man? Because I know you're somebody who wants kids. Like, what are your thoughts about where this is going and what the future is going to look like?
I mean, honestly, I could understand somebody who could have that sort of fearful impulse, right? And not necessarily want to bring their children into a world that could be, you know, looking and feeling very chaotic in the future, right? I
Trending
mean,
there.
imagine, yeah, sea levels rise, flooding, like crazy flooding in, places like Florida, New York, um, intense, weather pattern shifts,
Yeah.
like things like that. I mean, would you want your child to potentially deal with things like that? And I mean, I think for somebody to now be thinking about those things, it's not entirely unrealistic, right? I mean, I forget by what year, like, uh, we should really be addressing climate change even more seriously than we currently are. But I forget what the date is. Is it 2050 or something? I don't, I'm really
I
going.
mean, we have Rob, so he could tell
Yeah,
us.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, how about 2024?
Right.
2030, 2050, it depends on what metric you're talking about. I understand that people, I have a short section in the book about it because a person asked me that question. And my answer is just yes. Having a child is one of the most meaningful things any of us will ever do.
mhm.
And so I would say to young people, if you want to have a child, have one, and don't not have one because you think the world will be a bad place for that kid. You can make it a good place for your child. So run with that joy and find that meaning in your life. Don't let climate change keep you from having a child.
So you are, for the most part, then feeling hopeful about it, the future, I mean.
I am. I despair sometimes at the pace of change, at the inaction. I've been in this business for a long time and chair an international group called the Global Carbon Project. Every year we put out sort of a report card on emissions for that year.
Mhm.
Carbon dioxide, we do methane and nitrous oxide, and it's hard to see the years start blending into decades when you're my age. And I sometimes say I've watched years roll by like floats in a parade,
Mm.
and on the street, and those floats roll by slowly, and the next one rolls by slowly, and that's how the years feel to me with climate inaction. The years roll by, and pretty soon it's not years anymore, it's decades and decades of lost opportunity. That makes me sad that we haven't done more. The fact that we've waited so long means it will be more difficult to act now, but I still hope and believe that we can. And every tenth of a degree matters. So, there's still a place to make the world better.
Yeah. And this reminds me in some part, like I don't remember all of the details, but during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy and Gorbachev finally got a hold of each other through backdoor means, there was this sense that like nobody wanted nuclear war, even though on the, yeah, right, on each side you had, this, especially the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, they were kind of hyping it up and they're like, we can't look weak, they want to bomb us, they don't care, they're savages, like the othering or whatever. But yeah, fundamentally, you get this sense that even behind like the talking heads, even though in this case, I mean, Gorbachev and Kennedy were the talking heads, but behind the talking heads, you have people who fundamentally agree we don't want climate disaster. So it's just, I guess the point is to get it into the rhetoric, like the public sphere, right? Whether it's mainstream media, I don't know, man. Wait, so because you listen to like Rogan and stuff, does he care like that alternative side of things?
Sure, but like, the most recent thing that I've heard him say is like, and I don't want to butcher this, but essentially like, it might be real, it might not be
Same
real,
stuff,
but
right?
like that sort of thing. He
Mhm.
has had climate scientists on and that sort of thing, but I think that is the most recent sort of.
Mm.
But regardless of that, one area where I really have hope is it's kind of related to capitalism in the sense that, so like for example, electric vehicles, right? Like you were saying, Rob, earlier, like they've gotten, they're pretty cool. they've gotten way better. The amount of energy that can be stored in the battery and how far you can go now is way better than what it used to be. That's going to continue to get better. There
Mhm.
will be a bigger up, like a larger appeal in people purchasing that sort of product, right? So that's an area where I have a lot of hope in terms of what you call it, solar energy as well. I'm sure there are going to be advances in that, and that's going to be more widespread. And then one area where I'm not sure about still is the plant-based food, and I hope you can like shed some light on this. It's just that, and I know there is a anecdote of your son and I believe his friend in the book.
Mhm.
Having a regular burger and then a plant-based burger
Hmm.
from, I believe, Impossible Foods, and they were like detecting the differences, and there wasn't that much of a difference. But one thing that has at least been fed to me, and this could be wrong,
No
is
pun
that,
intended.
and I'm sure, and right, sure, uh, is that like some of these plant-based foods, based on the oils and whatever else goes in there, something about it's not like healthy or as healthy as having like the actual burger. But I was wondering what you might have to say about plant-based foods and where we're kind of headed with that.
Yeah, great question. The anecdote in my book is actually on a fishing trip. I was fishing for steelhead with a couple college buddies and one of my sons, and we got evacuated or ordered out because of a fire in Southern Oregon. And so we had a couple days to kill, and so we did this taste test for Impossible Burgers and normal hamburgers. And I am, the Impossible Burger was I've had Impossible Burgers before, but my Texas carnivore college friends hadn't, and my son had had them before. They were pretty good. I don't know that I would say they were better than a real burger, but they were comparable to a real burger. And as I think, I don't remember my son's exact quote, but he said it doesn't have to be better if I feel like I'm doing the right thing for the world. If it's as good as or close to, that's enough for me. And so, uh, eating lower on the food chain, eating a more plant-based diet will save land, it save water, preserve more habitats for other species. So I think there's a lot of progress we can make there. Most of us in countries like the U.S. eat more than enough protein in our lives. I can give up, well, I don't eat much meat except fish anymore,
Yeah.
but we can give up some protein in our lives and actually, again, make ourselves healthier, not just help the climate, but have better blood chemistry and maybe even live longer. So I think there's a place for a more plant-based diet. The issue with the foods like the Impossible and the Beyond Meat burgers is that, as Pat Brown said, the CEO in my book, he said, my goal isn't to make a you know a plant-based burger that's healthier than a kale salad. It's to make a plant-based burger that's better than a beef hamburger. And
Mhm.
he
Mm,
stands by the fact that it is. They are processed fairly heavily, so there are a lot of ingredients to go into them, and some people aren't completely comfortable with that. But that industry is growing. I think they're getting better. I was just
yeah.
at a X Prize conference last week, and they had salmon and chicken, and they were pretty darn good.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I love to fish. I used to hunt. I don't hunt much anymore. I like meat, but I don't eat much meat anymore because I don't really feel responsible um, doing
Hmm.
that. That's a personal decision. No one else has to do something just because I do it.
Well, would it be fair to say that feeling like a good person can actually make your food taste better?
I said that. I guess that I would say that. I actually don't know. Ask a psychologist that.
I
But
love
I'll
that.
answer it anyway. Sure.
Yeah, that'll help people. No, but honestly, I think a little bit of that. I mean, this is now complete conjecture, but I think a little bit of the Impossible Burgers, honestly, just feeling like you're doing the right thing, like with your son. I have to assume that that's at least some part of it. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree.
All right then. So as we start wrapping up, Alan, final questions for Rob before we go.
Oh, yes. If we wanted to follow your work, follow you as well, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Well, the book's available on, Amazon, Goodreads. So
Ooh.
I support your local independent bookseller if you can. My website for the book is intotheclear.com. and it has links to purchase it there. It has some photographs from the book, some pieces I wrote that when the book came out, that came out in the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, magazines like Orion, Fast Times did a profile of the steel company I interviewed for the book. So that's all there. My lab website is jacksonlab.stanford.edu, or just look me up, Rob Jackson at Stanford. Yeah, I guess hashtag into the clear blue sky is the social media link. So yeah, just if people want to reach out to me, rob.jackson@stanford.edu, send me an email, tell me what you're passionate about, and tell me what you think. I'm happy to listen and respond. So thank you both for having me.
Absolutely, Rob. This was literally like meeting royalty. I kid you not, and I'm not exaggerating. This was such an honor. Thank you so much for this. Such an excellent episode.
Thank you, guys. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks for everything you do.
Absolutely.
Okay. That was great. So, everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you can, of course, follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.